Good morning, everyone. This is Pastor Bob, and it's time for our midweek message. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at why we do some of the things we do as Christians. And today I want to ask the question, why do we do some of the things we do that aren't even in the Bible? Now, a couple examples, and I've mentioned these in sermons recently, and it's turned a couple heads because people didn't know that. And this will give me a time to clarify this. But there's two things that are not prescribed in the Bible. They're not saying, by God, you have to do these. There's no examples of them in the Bible, and that is weddings and funerals, at least in the modern sense of the term. So let's pick this apart, and let's ask why we do what we do today, even though it's not prescribed anywhere in the Bible. There's not even examples of it, at least as far as we understand it today in the modern sense of the term. So let's start with funerals. In the ancient world, when someone passed away that you loved, burial had to be quick for obvious reasons that I think you can put together on your own. There was no priest. There was no rabbi. There was no official ritual. There was no $10,000 bill from the funeral home. Usually there was a burial. It was done on private land or private mausoleum. Sometimes there was cremation, but that's kind of a newer idea, at least as far as Judeo-Christian cultures go. It wasn't all the ceremony and pomp that we have today. The only time you saw the ceremony, pomp, and ritual, stuff like that, would have been if a powerful government official or very wealthy person passed away, because they had the money for embalming. And funerals very much were a display of status, wealth, and power. So the only funerals, and they still look nothing like what we do today, were processionals with grand displays of status and prestige. Nothing like today. There wasn't any ceremony at the local synagogue or ritual. Sometimes there would be some prayers, depending on what century we're talking about, but it was reserved for only the very rich. Looked nothing like what we see today. Now, what was neat about the ancient tradition was there was less emphasis for the normal everyday folks like you and I, the 99%. There was no ceremony, pomp, anything like that. But what was neat was there was a lot of support afterwards, meaning, hey, this family has lost somebody. That person helped their family survive on the farm or was a worker or a tradesman or whatever. And in the ancient world, there was no welfare, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, nothing like that. If you lost someone from your family, not only was it an emotional blow, it could affect your survival, depending on who it was. And so the village or the family would get together and really support that person afterwards, not only emotionally and through the grieving process, but also in a very real and practical way. And that's something we've lost today. I've heard from people over and over, they lose someone, they're grieving, they're in shock. Sometimes the death is expected, but sometimes they're in shock. And in the meanwhile, they have to put together this huge, grand, expensive ceremony and ritual and funeral home and casket and a catered dinner afterwards and visitation and the processional and police escort. I mean, they have to put together all this stuff. And that's not biblical. And then I hear afterwards, people will say after the ceremony was over, I didn't hear from anyone. It's crickets. And that's really when they need the support, is afterwards. They don't need the grand pomp and circumstance and ritual and expense. They need the support afterwards. And that's something that ancient cultures did really well that we've lost. But back to my original point, funerals in the modern sense of the term are not prescribed or described anywhere in the Old or New Testament. Not in the modern sense of the term, not at all. The second one I'd like to pick apart are weddings. Now, this one's going to take a little more time, and this is going to take a little bit of unpacking because there's always been marriages. You see marriages all throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, you see marriages between one man, one woman. You see polygamy. You see concubines. You see a lot of rules and prescriptions. But as far as weddings, there are no weddings. Why? Well, because the wedding, the joining of two people together in marriage, I don't like using the term wedding because when people think weddings today, they think of a church and a ritual and a ceremony and a ring, flower girls, honeymoon, all this stuff. None of that is anywhere in the Bible. That would have been a foreign concept to anyone in Scripture. Matter of fact, we'll talk about where that came from here in just a minute. But in the ancient world, the joining of two people together in marriage started with a betrothal. You see this right in the infancy narratives about Jesus, and with Joseph and Mary, they were betrothed. Now, what a betrothal was generally a year period where they couple formally got to know each other, because most marriages were arranged. The marriage for love is a new idea. So the marriage would have been put together by the parents. The betrothal period gave the couple a chance to get to know each other, even though still formally. And the parents, usually the dads of both families, to work out the marriage contract. The marriage contract, because this was a family and civil affair. Religion had nothing to do with it. There was no priest. There was no pastor. There was no ceremony. There was no ritual and regulation from the dogma of the church. There was none of that stuff. This was a civil and family affair where the two families were being joined together with a contract and working out the details of the contract called a ketubah. And if you have any Jewish friends that are married, I would bet you today, if you ask them, they have a ketubah as well. Because this was a contract that talked about what property would be exchanged, what conjugal rights would be between the couple, what to do if there was children, what if the man sent the wife off in divorce, how much money would they then pay for her support. The ketubah contained all of that details of the family contract. And what you see, because a lot of people say, well, Pastor Bob, there's a wedding at Cana in the second chapter of John. That was not a wedding in the sense of the term. What you're seeing there is the signing of the ketubah and the party afterwards. There was no priest, there was no ritual, there was no going down the aisle, there was no vows exchange. It was a signing of the ketubah, and what you're seeing in John is the celebration afterwards. Now, let me add one more thing before we go any further. What made a marriage official was not even the ketubah, not even the party afterwards, but the consummation. And that has been in nearly every culture all throughout history. So that's nothing new. But anyway, that's what made it official. And so that's why I think the Bible has so many prohibitions against fornication, because that is to be reserved for a marriage couple. That is where two become one flesh. That is where people come together, and it should always be in the context of marriage. So anyway, conversation for another time, but that's when it became official. What we're seeing in John is the party afterwards. Matter of fact, let's go through the story. They're having a party afterwards, and they're running out of wine. So Mary comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, we're almost out of wine. Kind of do your thing. And Jesus says, it's funny, and it always baffles me what he says. His response is, woman, my time has not yet come. I'm like, man, if I would say that to my mom. Anyway, he says, woman, my time has not yet come. But he, as an obedient son, does it anyway. He changes the jars of water to wine. And it's interesting. This is right in Scripture. People comment on the wine afterwards, and they say, you know what? Usually at these marriage parties, we have the good wine at first, and as people become inebriated and they can't tell what they're drinking anymore, then they bring out the cheap wine, and it says, but you have brought out the best wine. So in that setting, we do not see a ritual or ceremony by Jesus or by a priest. Jesus is the bartender. He made the wine, and not only the wine, the best wine. So again, this form of weddings we see today is nowhere in the Bible. Now, how did they come about? Well, early on in the early church, first 4 centuries, there were certain areas of the empire as Christianity began to spread where they would ask for a priest blessing afterwards, meaning the couple's gotten together, there's a family contract, the deal's sealed, hey, call up the priest, have them come over and do a blessing afterwards. That's the most you're going to see anywhere in the early church. Now, as you go on throughout time, a theology of marriage, and particularly in the western half of the church, starts to be developed. And you start seeing a couple things happen. One, you see the church rise very much in secular power. and they become what historians term, and what they even called themselves, the Holy Roman Empire. And the church realized that the Bible has a lot to say about marriage, and they realized that we can control marriage and who marries who across the chessboard of Europe, thus helping them control the political sphere all across Europe. And so the church decides to make marriage a sacrament. Thus, they have complete control over who gets married, what the rules are, what happens before they're married, what happens afterwards, and whether they can get divorced. You don't see that until the 13th century, roughly. It's either 1241 or 1267. Let me just take a look at my notes here. Let's see. 1215. The church at the Fourth Lateran Council decided that marriages should be public. So they hadn't quite gotten into it yet, but they decided that they should at least be public. No secret marriages. And here we go. 1545, the Council of Trent actually codified specific requirements valid for a marriage. So you see that in 1545, but it's here it is. It's 1261 when the church actually started to control marriage. And see what that did, it had a practical matter to it as well as a theological one. The church was very much in power. We'd been through crusades, they had armies, they were just overall, they functioned much more like a nation state and less like a church. And they wanted to control all of Europe. And matter of fact, they would decide who could be kings or not. And a lot of times the kings would want to be blessed by the Pope. There's a whole lot that goes into that. But one of the things they could do is control the politics of Europe by controlling who marries who. We set up all the rules. We set up all the regulations. The church controls it all. Don't defy the church or you won't get into heaven. And people followed it. Matter of fact, there's a famous story I bet you've heard of where Henry VIII wanted a divorce because he couldn't have an heir, a male heir. And the Pope says, no, you can't. You can't have a divorce. See, right there you see where they're controlling who marries who, because he was good friends with Henry VIII's wife's parents. And he said, no, you can't get divorced. So you start seeing the control of marriage. And what happens is along with that, you start seeing ceremonies come about and rituals, only for the rich, not for regular folks. And these grand celebrations as these royal marriages come together. And eventually what happens is, as we get into later periods, we start seeing normal everyday folks like you and I wanting those kind of rituals and those kind of celebrations. We started seeing a burgeoning middle class arise. We started seeing people could afford ceremonies and stuff like that. And so in the later Middle Ages, early Renaissance period, you start seeing more normal people having marriage and the church still controlling it. So anyway, that's where it comes from. Now, there was pushback. In the Protestant Reformation, the 16th century, they pushed back against a lot of Catholic beliefs. That's why it's called the Protestant Reformation. They were protesting what the church was doing at the time, which they saw as not biblical and not fit. And major groups, including the Calvinists and the Lutherans early on, when they were asked to regulate and perform weddings, they pushed back and said, no, those are a civil affair. The church should not do those. And even here in America, in early American period, pilgrims, dissenters, and different groups that had come over from Europe refused to do weddings, calling them a civil affair. So anyway, there's a little bit of history. It kind of arose in the later Middle Ages as the church decided it wanted to regulate and put together all kinds of, control for the weddings. Next thing you know, a priest has to be involved or a pastor. Then you've got rituals. The exchange of rings, that's actually an old Roman tradition that comes out of prior to Christianity. Anyway, you start seeing that develop. And then you get to what we have today, where you have these grand ceremonies at great expense. I think the average wedding now is like $20,000. I know our wedding, we got married right out of high school. And matter of fact, as of last week, we've been together 33 years, counting high school. We haven't been married that long, but we started dating in high school. We got married right afterwards. And our wedding, we had a simple wedding, and we couldn't afford it. And ours was still expensive. I don't remember what it cost, But I remember being young and it just costing quite a bit for us, and it's nothing compared to some of the weddings I've done today. But today we got this whole ritual, and the church feels like it needs to control it, and we've got doctrine around it, and rules and regulations, all that. But that's not anywhere in the Bible. It was a private contract between two families with a ketubah, a celebration afterwards, then consummation. It was purely a family and a civic affair. There wasn't religious involvement until almost 1,200 years later. Now, don't get me wrong. I love doing weddings. I love doing weddings. I don't know why. I'm just weird. I like doing weddings. I like the pomp. I like the ceremony. I like the beauty around it. But I realize that's not biblical. It's stuff we've made up. It's rituals that we've written. Now, don't get me wrong. The Bible does have a lot to say about marriage, but nothing about weddings. And so this idea of weddings is all stuff that we have brought up through Christian tradition over the last 2,000 years. And what little you do see in the Bible, as far as joining two people together in marriage, is nothing like what we would call or use the language for to describe a wedding today. And so anyway, let me wrap this up. We're getting a little long, but the traditions we have, a lot of them are well-meaning and they're good and they're enjoyable. That includes holidays. That includes a lot of things Christians do. But we have to, if we're going to be intellectually honest and faithful to the scriptures, realize they're not in the Bible. We have to realize that this is a different category. It may follow some theological thought. It may be biblical in intent, but it's not in the Bible. And Christians do lots of stuff that's not specifically prescribed in the Bible. And I wouldn't say that's a bad thing, but we need to know the difference, because today with the internet and with a lot of people never, going to church, they're going to Google it and they're going to say, wait a second, I was at this church and they said that's in the Bible. And right here, AI has just shown me it's not. We need to be clear about what's in the Bible, what's not, what's prescribed, what's not, if we want to be intellectually honest and faithful to the scripture. So anyway, you guys can dig in more. I'm actually writing a book on marriage. I've been working on it for 2 years, not only the history of marriage, but how young couples or new couples can thrive in marriage. If I ever get time to work on it, I will, but at least you know why we do that. Thanks.